It's a very exciting time here in Ontario, Canada right now because it's officially nut season. So today we're going to be talking all about black walnuts, which are usually ready to harvest at the end of September to early October. As we all know, walnuts tend to be extremely expensive at the grocery store. So if you can find and forage them for free, that's a huge win. Black walnuts are native to Central and Eastern North America, and they grow best in damp soil conditions. They're commonly found growing alongside rivers and creeks, and they thrive in full sun exposure. To identify black walnut trees, look for trees that have dark, deeply ridged bark with large and long compound leaves. Compound leaves are leaves that are composed of many smaller leaflets that are attached by a central stem. The leaflets usually grow in pairs opposite of each other and are sometimes missing the leaflet at the tip. The leaves are serrated, which means they're sawtooth in appearance. When the leaves are crushed, they give off a spicy, citrusy aroma, which is a key identifying feature when you're identifying black walnut trees. The trees are capable of growing over 100 feet high, but not to worry, you don't have to climb these trees to reach the nuts. When the nuts are fully ripened and ready for consumption, they will fall to the ground on their own. Once they're on the ground, the trickiest part is getting to them before the squirrels do. The nuts are encased in a shell within a thick, round husk. The husks are green but turn dark brown and black as they begin to rot. The husks also give off a very citrusy aroma. If the husks have begun to turn brown and mushy, the nut meat is probably still perfectly fine due to being protected by a thick, strong shell. There's a test that you should do prior to consuming these nuts to make sure that the nut meat is still okay to eat. It's called the float test, but we'll talk about that in a second. Something very important to note when you're husking black walnuts is that the husk stains every single thing it comes into contact with dark brown. So your skin, your clothing, literally everything. And it's very, very hard to get out of your skin. So my biggest recommendation when you're husking these walnuts is to husk them wearing either black clothing, old clothing, or clothing that you don't care about, and also to wear gloves. When husking black walnuts, you should husk them right away and also husk them in the same area that you found them in. If you don't remove the husks before storage, there's a high potential for the nut meat to become very bitter and unpleasant. So that being said, it's essential to remove the husks if you want high quality and good flavor. The best way to husk these walnuts is to just step on them and roll them underneath your foot until the husk breaks apart and the shell is exposed. Remember to use those gloves. The shell is rounded, dark brown or black in color, has deep ridges, and is extremely hard. Black walnuts also contain a chemical called juglone, which is naturally produced by members of the walnut family, and it's also a natural herbicide and toxic to most plants. And this is the reason why I feel that you should husk black walnuts exactly where you found them, because the soil where black walnut trees is already affected by the juglone chemical and it's not going to cause any additional damage. If you bring these black walnuts home and you husk them in your backyard, near your garden, whatever, you're risking introducing this juglone chemical to your soil, which can cause a huge negative impact if you're trying to grow vegetables, flowers, all that kind of stuff. The juglone chemical is a natural herbicide, so you're risking stunting the growth of your plants or inhibiting growth altogether. This is also why you should never place any part of a black walnut in with your compost. Once the husks are removed, wash the walnuts until the water runs clean. Don't soak the walnuts for too long because you don't want to risk making them mold. Now we're on to the float test. Fill a container with some water and place the walnuts inside. A good, healthy walnut will sink to the bottom, and you're going to discard any walnuts that float. Floating nuts signify that the nut meat is no good. Usually it means that the nut meat is underripe, the nut is empty, the nut is damaged, or it's gone bad. The squirrels still might appreciate those walnuts, so I give the floaters back to the squirrels. The nuts then need to be cured in a cool place with good ventilation. You can lay them out on screens or cardboard boxes, whatever works for you, with some sort of fan going over top of them to move air. It's very important that the nuts are completely dry, and they should be fully cured in about 2 to 3 weeks. If the nuts are stored in a cool, dark, and dry area with good airflow, they can last for months or even over a year. Some people like to remove the nut meat from the shell before storing. If you're going to do it that way, you should leave them in the fridge. These shells are notoriously difficult to open and require either a nutcracker that is specifically designed for black walnuts or a hammer. I have broken so many nutcrackers attempting to crack these things, so a regular nutcracker just won't cut it. The nut meat within the shell will be white, a little bit papery, and have a strong, earthy, and aromatic flavor. After you're done the tedious task of cracking all the walnuts, you're left with a very small reward. This is the nut meat from about 15 walnuts. I know what you're probably thinking. This is a pathetically small amount of walnuts to bother doing anything with. Unfortunately, the walnuts started falling from the trees right before I was leaving on a long backcountry canoe trip, and between me, the other gatherers, and the squirrels, this was all I managed to gather. In reality, I did actually gather about 30 walnuts, however, only half my walnuts passed the float test. Candied walnuts are extremely easy to make, and they only require one other ingredient: sugar. Typically, you would use about a quarter cup of sugar for every 1 cup of walnuts. However, I only had about a third cup of walnuts, so I just eyeballed the sugar. Add the sugar and the walnuts to a pot over medium-high heat. Make sure you stir frequently because you don't want your sugar or your walnuts to burn. These cook very quickly, usually only within a few minutes. We're only cooking until the sugar is liquefied, the walnuts smell a little bit toasty, and are nicely coated in the liquefied sugar. Make sure you thoroughly check the little nut bits before you cook them, just to make sure there aren't any sharp pieces of shell left behind. The shell bits can be razor sharp and hard as rock, so we really want to make sure that we're not consuming these. Once the walnuts are cooked, you're just going to spread them out flat over a baking sheet coated in parchment paper. I'm just going to add a small sprinkle of sea salt just to give it a little bit extra flavor. Normally I would just eat these as a snack, but because there aren't very many, I was trying to find another way that I could utilize them. I had recently foraged some apples from some rogue apple trees, so I thought it might be fun to bake some miniature wild apple walnut pies. I soaked the apples in a water vinegar solution just in case there were any worms hiding inside. I peeled all the apples, cut them into chunks, and I placed them in a sterilized mason jar. I made one massive mistake here. I planned on canning the apple pie mixture because the apples were ready to harvest long before the walnuts fell from the trees. I didn't want to risk the apples going bad, so I decided to make the mixture ahead of time and can it, but I made one major mistake. I forgot to blanch my apples before I canned them. Apples can have a lot of trapped gas within the fruit, and if you don't blanch the apples prior to canning them, these gases can be released during the canning process, which can cause an enormous amount of siphoning. Siphoning is when you lose liquid from your canning jars during the canning process, and I had a lot of liquid loss. Since I knew I was using this apple pie mixture in the short term, I wasn't too concerned, and I was just going to keep it in the fridge anyway, but this is something that you need to take into consideration if you're planning on making apple pie filling and canning it for long-term storage. I add about a half a tablespoon of lemon juice to the jar just to preserve the colors of the apples and to add some acidity when canning. I then add roughly a third of a cup of sugar, a teaspoon of cinnamon, quarter teaspoon of nutmeg, and a quarter teaspoon of salt to a pan, and I whisk until it's well combined. Next, I'm adding about 2 cups of water. Cook over medium-high heat, stir until everything is well combined, and cook until all the sugar has dissolved. Pour the hot mixture over the apples, leaving about a half an inch of headspace. Make sure you debubble your jar to make sure you release any trapped air. Clean the rim with a clean cloth and some vinegar, and screw on the lid until it's only fingertip tight. I processed my jar in a steam canner for 25 minutes. Now to make the pie crust. To make the pie crust, I'm going to be using sourdough starter because that's what I have on hand and I really enjoy the flavor. I'm starting with 350 grams of all-purpose flour, 6 grams of salt, and 14 grams of sugar. Whisk everything so that it's well combined. Next, I'm adding 226 grams of cold, unsalted butter. I'm tossing it in the flour mixture and breaking it up into teeny tiny pieces. I'm then adding in 74 grams of water and 190 grams of sourdough starter. This is a terrific way to use sourdough discard. I mix until the dough just comes together and then I knead it for a little bit. I form the dough into a disc and then I cut it in half using a bench scraper. I form the dough into balls, which I then tightly wrap in parchment paper and place in the fridge for a minimum of 2 hours. After the dough is done chilling, I roll it out with a rolling pin on a floured surface. I then use a greased cup to cut out little circles for my miniature pies. I didn't add a thickener at the time of canning, so I'm going to thicken my mixture now. I'm adding my apple pie filling to a pot over medium heat, and I'm using some of the juice from this mixture to create a cornstarch slurry in order to thicken it up. I'm adding a crumb layer before I fill my pies to help prevent the pies from becoming soggy. A crumb layer is just a mixture of a little bit of flour with a little bit of sugar. To make my miniature apple pies, I'm using a muffin tin. I add the apple pie mixture to the pie crusts. I wanted some sort of barrier between the pie filling and the candied walnuts, so I added some lattice with my extra pie dough. I know I didn't do the lattice properly, but it doesn't really matter what it looks like because once the walnuts are placed on top, it's not really going to show. I baked them in the oven at 375 degrees Fahrenheit for about 25 minutes until they were nicely golden brown. These turned out so good and they tasted phenomenal. These ended up being the perfect fall treat.